My name is Sabir, pronouns he, him, and I run events here at The Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Chris Bale's new book, Breaking the Social Media Prism, How to Make Our Platforms Less Polarizing, I'd like to share a little bit of history about The Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 93 years, Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, we wouldn't be here today. And as a final note, our thanks to our friends at C-SPAN for sharing tonight's event. Tonight, we are thrilled to have with us Chris Bale for the launch of his newest book, Breaking the Social Media Prism. Chris Bale is a professor of sociology and public policy at Duke University, where he directs the Polarization Lab. A leader in the emerging field of computational social science, Bale's research examines fundamental questions of social psychology, political polarization, and technology using large-scale experiments on social media platforms, in-depth interviews, and the latest advances in machine learning. Bale has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN. Bale regularly lectures to audiences in government, business, and the nonprofit sector, struggling to combat polarization. His award-winning book, Terrified: How Anti-Muslim Fringe Organizations Became Mainstream, was among the first to explain how social media drives political extremism using the tools of data science. Joining Chris in conversation is Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist at New York University's Stern School of Business. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1992 and taught for 16 years in the Department of Psychology at the University of Virginia. Haidt is the author of The Happiness Hypothesis, Finding Modern Truth in Ancient Wisdom, and of the New York Times bestsellers The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, and The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas are Setting Up a Generation for Failure, co-authored with Greg Lukianoff. He has written more than 100 academic articles. In 2019, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and was chosen by Prospect Magazine as one of the world's top 50 thinkers. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. We will be doing an audience Q&A, so if you have any questions for Chris, you can drop them in the chat or add them to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And with that, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jonathan and Chris to the stage.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sabir. Thanks for getting us through those technical difficulties. Now, it is 7:20 on a Friday night here on the East Coast. So I told Chris that I was going to be drinking, and I invited him to have a drink. I'm trying these new alcoholic lemonades, which are good in a way, but they're too sweet. What are you drinking?
Well, now you're talking about a very polarizing product, John. I wouldn't touch this stuff.
So what are you drinking?
This is one of the finest local beers in North Carolina down here.
Okay, why don't you hold it up for the camera so people can see?
Sure.
Give them a little free press. Okay. All right. So I'm really pleased to be doing this with you. I guess I'll give the audience a little bit of background, and then we'll hear from you about your story, and we'll really try to make this whole thing useful to people. You're writing about things that everybody is wondering about and kind of freaking out about in many cases. So Chris, just for the audience here, Chris is studying one of the hottest topics and biggest questions that we're all facing, which is basically what the hell is happening to us, and doesn't social media have something to do with it? Like we all kind of sense that there's something going on there. And so I'd read some of Chris's research, and we've been in correspondence, and we had a great conversation by Zoom, and I knew that he had this book coming out. He asked me to check it out, and then I read it and loved it and offered a blurb. And so I think I'll just read my blurb because it really is, what I think about the book and why it's so important. Chris Bale has done some of the best research on the polarizing effects of social media. In this important and accessible work, Bale shows that if you want to understand what's going on online, then don't focus on people's exposure to information. Rather, you should keep your eye on people's quest for status and their sense of group identity. Pardon me, that's those carbonated things. The book is rich with insights for anyone who uses social media, and it is essential reading for anyone who wants to improve it. So Chris, why don't you tell us, going back to maybe start the story in grad school perhaps, but how is it that you came to study this topic and write this book? I mean, it's almost as if like, picking this topic, it's almost like buying Bitcoin and Tesla a year ago. It's just like, boom,
Yeah.
Well, this will, who knows, this may be remunerative eventually. So how did you get onto this topic? Was there like an event or a thing you saw happening?
Sure. Well, first, let me say thanks, John, for doing this. It's a real treat and an honor to be here with you. Thanks to the Strand for arranging this. I first got into this during a moment in US history, which was pretty important. For the first time, out-party hate surpassed in-party love around the time that I started graduate school. Now we've reached the point where between 40 and 50% of Democrats and Republicans, according to some surveys, are willing to use violence to achieve political ends. And so I think we've really reached a crisis point. And, I think you put your finger on it when you say, what is the role of social media in this? And, when I set out to investigate some of the prevailing narratives, some of the popular ideas about what divides us on social media, I was really shocked to discover that, there really wasn't a lot of evidence to support ideas like echo chambers, foreign misinformation campaigns.
Right. These words were all over the place, but yeah, they weren't grounded.
Exactly, yeah, and the upsetting though important truth that I've discovered in this book, I think, is that it's really us, it's social media users who are driving the problem. Even if we could get platforms to enact every single policy change many of us might like to see, it probably wouldn't move the needle a
lot. Okay, I hope I can push back on you on that later, because we'll get to that, because and I hope you're not letting them off the hook. I know you're not. So,
no, absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I'm just saying,
Right. So these conversations tend to be kind of scattered, and like a lot of things these days, people use one word and they think it means one thing, but other people are making a contrary argument because they're using words differently in part. So it would help me, and I think everyone, if we're clear about what exactly is social media. I mean, obviously there's lots of different kinds. Like, what are the kinds that matter? What are the kinds that are polarizing, and what are the features of it? So, is it TikTok? I mean, we all think Facebook and Twitter, but is it Reddit, YouTube, TikTok? Like, what matters?
I think we're in the early days of social media. During every big technological upheaval, from the printing press on to radio to TV to cable TV, we've seen these sudden surges in differences in the way that we think about things like the public. To some degree, technology makes the idea of the public possible because we're all able to encounter each other in virtual settings. And so I think the unique thing for me about social media is that it allows us to have conversations with lots of different types of people, maybe broadens the scale of our conversations, also changes the pace of our conversations. But certainly I think, as you've said, I'm old enough to remember platforms like MySpace, which many younger people have never heard of. So, social media is evolving. I think it's a little premature to say exactly what it is, but the unique characteristics for me are that it allows kind of virtually anyone to enter a conversation about politics. And, that has, the potential for good, but also, as we've seen, the potential for a lot of bad.
Okay, so given that you're focusing on the political and social effects, the key is that it allows people to talk to strangers about politics. Okay, now what about, just one other thing to ask about, because I've been studying, I've only been studying social media for a couple of years, and I'm focused on the effects it's had on teen mental health. My book with Greg Lukianoff, The Coddling the American Mind. So I've been focusing on how what seems to drive people crazy, or at least drive them into depression, is the feature of user-generated content, and then the user sits there waiting. Who liked it? Wait, why did they like her picture more than mine?
Right.
So it's the rating. Is that important, or is it just this is just a product of strangers meeting and having conversations?
Absolutely. I think the single greatest driver of political polarization on social media is the rapidly growing gap between real life and social media. I think we all know people who would say something online that they'd never say in person, but the more we get isolated from each other, and I think the pandemic has laid this bare, the more we come to rely on social media to understand each other. And to that end, and the reason I called my book Breaking the Social Media Prism is because I think, social media is really distorting the way we understand each other and ourselves. It's really, accelerating parts of human nature that, as you say, lead to things like status seeking, especially among people who are social outcasts, but also makes moderates seem almost completely invisible. And together, I think those two kind of orthogonal forces make us all feel more polarized than we really are.
Right. Oh, that's yes, that is great, because that's really something that I've been observing on campus as I've been studying what's been happening on campus, which has then spread into so many other institutions and especially the creative industries and now into into high schools, is it's always been the case that the extremes or the most angry people are the loudest, but then once social media really spreads, it's like they go way up and the other people are just like keeping their head down. And one student, I'll never forget a student who said to a friend of mine, she said her motto is "silence is safer." That's horrible for a college student to. That's her motto of going through college. Okay, so it's a prism. It distorts our perceptions of reality. It changes the pattern of who can speak and who's just being silent. Okay. Now what? Okay, let's be clear about the harms. So you mentioned polarization in your title. What are the harms that you're interested in, or what are the harms done by these kinds of social media platforms?
Yeah, I think it does two things, the social media prism. It fuels status-seeking extremists, and again, it kind of mutes moderates. So let's talk about extremists for a minute. Let me just blow your mind with one statistic, John. Okay. 73% of tweets about politics are made by just 6% of Twitter users. And it won't surprise you to know that those 6% of Twitter users have, very extreme views. So each time we log on and, encounter someone on the other side, we're not seeing, a typical person. We're seeing an extremist, just like you thought. And one of the things we did in this book was we were able to both trace people online using the tools of data science, collect, hundreds of millions of tweets and massive social networks. But we also did in-depth interviews with people, and we did a kind of a qualitative experiment. And in the course of that research, we discovered how profound this gap between real life and social media can be. And the story that sticks to my mind is the story of this guy that I call Ray in the book. And Ray, when you meet him in real life, when we spoke with him, he'll say things like, he's the most polite, deferential guy, goes out of his way to, condemn racism. And he even says, oh, all these people on social media, they're just losers who live with their parents, right? Mm-hmm. Then we go to look at Ray online, and Ray is the most prolific political troll I've ever seen. And that's in like 10 years of studying this stuff. Each night he undergoes this kind of Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde style transformation, sharing meme after meme of, unspeakable things about, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Nancy Pelosi or Barack Obama, right? So the question that I think is really fascinating is like, what enables people to sustain these two kind of profoundly different identities online and off, and what consequences does that have for the rest of us?
Right. Well, so you're a sociologist, I'm a social psychologist. And the idea that people will be one way, in public, and then another way when they have anonymity makes a lot of sense. And of course, if you're a Freudian, that's just sort of obvious. Freud is kind of largely passé. But I think we both share actually Irving Goffman in common. I mean, so social psychology and sociology really share a sort of a Goffmanian approach. You have this great quote. We used to live in Goffman's world, but now we live in Mark Zuckerberg's world. Okay, can you explain that and assume that the audience doesn't know who Goffman is?
Yeah, so Goffman was way ahead of his time. In the 1960s, he was a sociologist who really wanted to understand, why we do this weird human thing, right? We all care so much about creating identities. And we care, compared to say a dog, right? We care a lot about these things called identities. And each day, Goffman discovered in this kind of deep, rich ethnographic work, each day we're kind of experimenting with our identities. We're trying on a different version of ourselves. We're looking at how other people react to that. And we're cultivating those identities that make us feel good about ourselves, that give us a sense of social status. And so, we've done this forever, and certainly social psychologists have, taken this up too, to wonderful places. The interesting question, I think, is how has social media reshaped this kind of fundamentally human process? And I think there's probably two ways. The first is, and you mentioned this earlier, John, it allows us to be, either fully anonymous or at the very least share, selective accounts of who we are. We have a much broader palette to experiment with our identities. And then on this, the second point, we have powerful, or at least more efficient, tools to monitor what other people are thinking about us, right? We get likes, we get those follows that you were talking about earlier that, create that endorphin buzz, and of course, we're not asking the important question, who's liking this, why, why am I doing this, right? It's all almost automatic, to use your metaphor, John, it's the elephant, not the rider.
Right. Yeah, so thanks for putting in those terms, in very psychological terms. I've been thinking a lot about behaviorism. So, in psychology, we have these, if you go back 100 years, it was, behaviorism versus Freudianism, like Godzilla versus, Mothra or something like that, these gigantic theories. And when I taught intro psych at UVA, I would explain them and then show how they kind of are, we don't talk about them that much. But my God, social media has really brought back B.F. Skinner. Because Skinner, for people in the audience who ever took a psychology course, there are these famous videos of Skinner training a pigeon to turn in a circle. And all he does is he waits until the pigeon turns a little bit to the left, and then he clicks, and the pigeon hears a click and knows that the click means that there's a little tiny grain of rice or some food. And then he waits till the pigeon turns a little bit more, and then he reinforces them. And so I think the way you put it is like we get to try things on. Well, we've always gotten to try things on. But now you get to try things on, and within a few minutes, you get either lots of pellets of grain or nothing, deafening silence, or you get nasty comments. And so,
Exactly.
Behaviorism is very, very powerful for training animals. If you can, but in real life, you don't get to reward people on a second basis. And when rewards are delivered minutes later, they don't work. Generally, they don't work very well. It really is, training animal behavior really is, can you get the reward within seconds?
Right.
And for the first time in human history, we are all putting ourselves out there and saying, world, train me, world, shape my behavior. And, for teenagers, this is completely disastrous. So I'm sorry, I'm passionate about this. And that's why I love your book so much, because I think we don't understand the many ways that this is changing the basic fabric of society in such a way that nothing works right anymore.
Exactly.
So tell us about some other harmful outcomes. So you talked about sort of the extremes and extremists. What else are you concerned about?
Right. So on the one hand, I totally agree with you that the Skinner analogy is apt. We are, kind of looking for that instant reward, a lot of us, but not everyone. And this is a key point. I'm not arguing that everyone has the potential to turn into this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde character. In fact, the average social media user never posts about politics and hardly posts at all, right? They're basically invisible. And the story in the book that really stuck out to me is a woman that I call Sarah. And Sarah, is, an interesting character. She leans conservative, but she's from New York City. She's half Puerto Rican. Her dad was a cop. She went to an Ivy League school. She's got very kind of nuanced views for a conservative and is very open to liberal ideas. But you'll never hear her talk about them on social media. Why? Well, when we asked Sarah, like we asked everyone in our interviews, tell us about the last time you used social media, she told us this amazing story. And something like this, well, I was up late putting my kids to sleep a few months ago, and, my husband owns a gun. He goes to a gun range, and, the NRA put out some posts saying, we support Americans' rights to own guns, something innocuous. She retweets it, replies a little bit to it. And then within minutes, she's getting these replies from people who have looked at her Twitter profile, found out she had kids, and are posting, "We hope your kids find your gun and shoot you." Yeah, and unfortunately, this kind of story is all too common in our data. And in fact, Pew, the one of the leading research firms out there, recently put out a study that suggested the number one reason that people are getting harassed online is for their political views. So, though the story of this Dr. Jekyll and Hyde character is really concerning, I think the even more pernicious effect of what I call the social media prism is it can make people like Sarah, who we desperately need to bring the conversation back to the
bridge
middle,
builders, as reasonable people.
invisible.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so the harms are fomenting extremism, silencing bridge builders, making people afraid. So we've got a variety of effects on democracy. Let's just talk about declining trust. What role, there's been a long decline in trust of institutions and also of each other. I don't know the data on it, and it may vary from country to country. So first, tell me what you know about declining trust and whether social media plays a role. And then let's briefly just talk internationally. Are all the Western democracies having the same problem, or is America unique?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that comparative question is fascinating. I think we don't yet have the data points, but there is variation here. A lot of countries are, polarization is actually going down in, for example, Germany. But one thing that we've seen across countries is the tendency for social media to drive false polarization. And this is our, kind of almost built-in human tendency to exaggerate the ideological extremity of the other side and minimize the ideological extremity of our side. Now, when we do survey research that look at things like trust as outcomes, one of the number one predictors is false polarization. One of the number one predictors of false polarization is social media usage across 10 countries in a recent study. So it does seem to be that one of the most pernicious effects here is kind of these meta perceptions, ideas we have about each other. And the exciting thing here, John, I think, is that we actually have an attempt, we can intervene at this level. We can correct misperceptions about each other. And then another new line of research shows that does build trust, that does reduce animosity between people.
Okay, and just, do you have anything else to say about cross-cultural comparisons? Because I know the study you're referring to, where you said Germany's going down, that one study, they were looking at polarization as party polarization.
Right.
And of course, in America, we have two parties. And so it's good, whereas in Europe, they have lots of parties.
Sure.
So I had a conversation with Mark Zuckerberg. He was reaching out to lots of people. I do commend him for that. He really was reaching out to get various competing views. And I was, saying, look, this is causing all kinds of polarization. And this was shortly after that article came out last January, a year ago, I think. And he said his theory was, well, if you look at where polarization, political polarization, party polarization is going up, it's mostly in the countries that have Rupert Murdoch, that have, Rupert Murdoch and Fox News. And so he was saying, he's trying to say that, well, it's not social media, it's not Facebook, it's Fox News and that sort of stuff. And that did fit with that study. What role do you think is it social media, or is it social media in sync with other things? Let's broaden the lens here. What's going on?
Absolutely. I think everybody is kind of asking this question, is social media driving political polarization? I think it's not quite the right question. We know that polarization was surging long before Facebook and Twitter came on. We can point to things like, the Southern strategy of the Democratic or Republican Party. We can point to market segmentation of cable news, creating perverse incentives for extremism for small markets. We could even point to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, which to some extent probably provided a common enemy, right? There's a lot of drivers. So I don't think, it's too productive, because we don't have counterfactuals. We can't explore an alternative reality where social media doesn't exist. But I do think that it's contributing to the problem. And I do think no matter what the answer to that question, we'll be left with the following question, which is, given that we're not going to leave social media anytime soon, how can we make it less polarizing?
Right. Okay. So I see that Tobias Rose Stockwell is in the audience here. So I'm a social psychologist who doesn't know a lot about social media per se. I just had a vague sense that it seems to be the cause of all these bad things. And I met Tobias, and we wrote an article together in The Atlantic, and Tobias really clued me into how these central social media platforms changed radically between 2009 and 2011 or 12. And you mentioned MySpace. That wasn't polarizing. That was just self-presentation. And then Tobias, we put our heads together, and our theory is that it's when Facebook introduces a like button and Twitter introduces the retweet button, and they copy each other, and then suddenly it gets much more engaging and much more about engagement, meaning emotions, meaning especially anger, and that's when we get what he calls an outrage machine. Yeah. So first, do you agree with that and that exact timing? Just give us, and if you do agree with that, well then what can we do? Like, how could we disassemble the outrage machine? Let's segue, because we should open up for questions from the audience about 5 minutes or so. But
yeah, Yeah, it's a great question. I do think we need top-down solutions. I do think we need to fundamentally rethink how algorithms, for example, rank content in our feed. I have a variety of ideas about how we can fix that. But I think if we really want to move the needle, the area we need to work on is bottom up. It's ourselves. The data are pretty clear now. I think even if we did make these changes, we'd still be a very polarized place, and there'd still be some incentives for people to be terrible to each other. And so, at least given the structure of the current platforms. And so what I think we need to do are a few things. We need to, one, learn how to see the social media prism. We need to understand the gap between social media and reality. We need to both learn how to avoid extremists, but also boost moderation. And we need to find better ways of talking across divides. And that's where your work has been such an inspiration to me, John. But one thing that I think is really important, and I know you and I share this vision. It's easy to say, okay, we all need to be more aware. We need to reach across the aisle, but none of these things are easy. If we're in the kind of blooming, buzzing confusion of social media, right? Things are flying all over the place at us. How do we really create durable changes? And that's where I think technology comes back in. Now that we've diagnosed the human drivers of polarization, we can do things like on polarizationlab.com, we've created a suite of apps that users can use to do things like identify and avoid extremists. Get a sense of what other people see about their politics from your posts by using, say, machine learning models that will classify you on a continuum from liberal to conservative, a bipartisanship leaderboard, which rewards people not for getting engagement from their own side, but for getting engagement from both sides, bots that retweet people on this bipartisanship leaderboard, other tools that track hashtags where Republicans and Democrats seem to be talking about the same thing in similar ways. We can use technology, in other words, instead of focusing on this small minority of actors, which is where all our attention is now, fighting misinformation, trolling, right? The very best interventions seem to have minimal impact and sometimes have a counterproductive impact. But we've done very little on boosting civility, boosting moderation. And so I think, if we're looking at where we can create the most impact, I think the bottom up is the most important.
Okay, so here's where I get to disagree with you, because if we think about all kinds of public health issues, smoking, overeating, and we psychologists have for a long time been saying, okay, people are designed for life in the savannah where sugar is rare, and if you find food, you gorge on it. And now they give us these super stimuli, and we're surrounded by junk food. And man, is it hard to get people to not overeat. And we know, of course, we're limited in the top-down solutions because we can't ban junk food. We can't, companies have a right to make things. Cigarettes, we were able to regulate, but it took a hell of a long time. It's very hard. And there we're talking about pleasure, like biological pleasures of the elephant, as it were. So my metaphor here is just, the mind is divided like a rider on an elephant. The rider is the conscious reasoning, but the elephant is much bigger and actually pretty smart. And you don't get change until you change the elephant. And it sounds to me like you've developed all these great tools, and these tools will show the rider what he's doing, and they will help the rider stay away from extremists. The elephant loves extremists. The elephant's attracted to them. It's exciting. And so, and the other things, they were like, food and physical pleasure, which is pretty addicting. Well, guess what? Social reputation blows out of the water anything else. I mean, concern about is just so much more powerful. So if you're saying, oh, we've got these platforms and they weren't so bad before 2009, and then they got really, really bad. And now, you know what? We all have to exert more self-control, and we need to understand. I'm saying, I'm not putting, I love your diagnosis. I'm going to, promote your book, and we've got to understand, but I'm not putting any money on your solutions. Until you tell me more of the top-down ones and the platform changes.
Sure. And to be clear, I'm not naive about this stuff. These aren't going to in themselves, create, a sea change in polarization. But let me take your analogy a little bit further, John. So, so many of us have benefited from this analogy, the elephant and the rider. But let's think about the environment that the elephant is navigating, right? And this is where sociology, I think, is particularly interesting, right? There are other elephants. There are sources of food, right? And that's where these top-down solutions really matter, right? So if we think about the landscape, right, it's really like the platforms are creating the playing field, but we're all playing it. And so
Right.
if we want top-down solutions, we have to think about how we incentivize better behavior. And there's a few ways we can do this. I think the most concrete and immediately actionable idea that I would love Facebook, Twitter, and any other social media platform to take up tomorrow is we can boost content that appeals to different types of people. So, right now you're rewarded for just engagement, and the easiest way to get an engagement online is to say something negative about Trump or negative about Biden. People come out of the woodwork and just like the stuff left and right, right? But those moderate stances, the kind of content that woman, Sarah, that I was talking about earlier might produce, right? There's no incentive, right? She has every disincentive, right? It's going to make Thanksgiving dinner weird. It's going to make, work hard. It's, she's going to be worried about her children. Why on earth would you go?
Oh, I know, it's so awful.
Right. Yeah. So the question, I think, is how do we design platforms with better incentives? And this is where the top-down stuff really gets me excited. So we in the Polarization Lab, we worked a long time with platforms trying to say, can we experiment on these core design features of social media? Because when you think about it, the crazy thing about all this is that we never have really considered in a concrete, empirical way, what would be the best design of social media platforms to encourage civility and moderation, right? Yeah. We've been content to allow platforms that were created for Harvard undergraduates to, rate each other's physical attractiveness, or in the case of Instagram, like arrange alcohol-centric gatherings. And we've been content to let these chaotically evolve into the primary forum for democracy in the 21st century. It's nuts, right? And so what we'd love to do is say, hey, Facebook, hey, Twitter, let us tweak some things here, like maybe try out this algorithm idea that I just mentioned. In the wake of Cambridge Analytica, that controversy where academic research was kind of repurposed or at least copied to serve, kind of arguably malicious political ends, right? Everything's been shut down. There's some glimmers of hope, but fundamental research on the guts of social media, the design principles, is not currently possible. And so what we did in the Polarization Lab is create our own social media platform for scientific research. And the cool thing about this is we can turn on and off different features of the platform. We can control who interacts with who, and we can really, we hope, try to pin down what works and what doesn't work.
Okay, so so these are the kinds of tools we're going to need to do research because we can't experiment on the platforms.
Exactly.
So, that is a way forward.
Right. And one of the solutions I know will surprise you, John. We've talked a lot about anonymity, and I remember when we first talked, you were suggesting, one of the big problems is anonymity, right? There's no social consequences for what people do online. And certainly that story about the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde character that I told earlier is a perfect example of that, right? On the other hand, anonymity has some underappreciated positive dimensions. So for example, if we're all kind of trapped in this us-them mentality and identity is, taking precedence over information, right? Then, when you think about it, anonymity in some ways drops identity out of the equation, right? We're no longer, liable to our peers. If I'm a Democrat who has concerns about defunding the police, right? If I post that on Twitter, right, all sorts of, there could be all sorts of negative consequences for me. If I'm a Republican concerned about, the narrative about voter fraud, right? It's going to create trouble for me if I post that. Anonymity gives us the time to explore unpopular ideas without peer pressure. And, there's some nice examples of this in the wild, like, for example, Reddit's Change My View, which is, though Reddit also has some of the most reprehensible material on the internet. This is a shining example, I think, of where, political compromise has been possible. And so we ran a study where we recruited a lot of Republicans and Democrats to create a made up social media platform. We told them, help us test a new social media platform. Unbeknownst to them, we paired them with a member of the other party to talk about one of two polarizing issues. We were pretty shocked to discover that people in this anonymous condition depolarized much more than people who didn't, especially Republicans. And I think that's particularly interesting. Maybe that suggests, in my view, that, the peer pressure on Republicans and the kind of spiral of silence kind of dynamics where people are, scared of sharing their unpopular views, maybe even stronger on the Republican side. And then maybe, anonymity in some very carefully designed forums, could be one way out.
Okay, so you're referring to your most famous study, the 2018 PNAS study. So if people want to, right, that's the study.
No, this is a new study that's only described in the book right now. It's a
Oh,
study that
wow,
we
okay.
just did last year. No, the earlier experiment was the one with the bots where we paid people to follow bots that exposed them to the other side for 1 month. Yeah.
Oh,
And
okay.
unfortunately,
This one is paired. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But
This is kind of the antidote
that's
to that.
right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's right.
No,
That was because that's where I first heard of it. Was this amazing study where you made up all these bots to interact with people, and you'd think that being exposed to the other side might help, but it actually made things worse. So now you found a way to do it. But let me just be clear.
Yeah.
I've never criticized anonymity.
Okay.
Tobias and I understand that, especially something like Facebook, which is operating on the world. Of course, you have to have you have to let people have anonymous accounts.
Exactly.
Our point is there's a difference between zero accountability and a tiny bit of accountability.
Right. Yeah.
And so what we want, what we're proposing, and I'd love to get just to see if this makes sense, and then is that anyone can sign up for an account on these platforms to see what's going on, because most people just want to see. But if you want to post content, you have to at least be verified that you're a real person in a particular country and you're over 18 or whatever it is, or over 13.
Absolutely.
And it could be done, it could be kicked out. It's not that Facebook is going to see your driver's license, but it could be kicked out to another entity. So the point is, if you say terrible things, well, you have a right to say terrible things, but if you make death threats, you can be found.
Exactly.
So that's our point. And actually, okay, so you agree that would really clean things up, because the trolls, like, trolls who are just kind of nasty, the FBI isn't going to get a court warrant to make them develop. But if you're actually planning a shooting of a synagogue or a mosque on Parler, or if you're making death threats to people and their kids on Twitter, you should be found. And so here's an amazing example. I mean, I hope the audience will really take this to heart, and when they tell people about this, they talk about this supreme irony. I don't know if you've noticed the chat, Chris. Have you?
I haven't been following it closely enough. No.
So a troll. So just as we've been talking,
are we getting trolled, John?
Yes. Some jerk just made up the most racist and nasty and pedophilic thing he could, and just posted it over and over again. And because of that, they had to disable the chat. And so this is becoming, like lone wolf terrorism that we're just gonna have to learn to live with. There are assholes in the world. This guy probably is nice to his wife and kids, and it's certainly a guy. We know that it's a guy, right? I mean, women don't do this.
Yes.
So it's really, this is actually quite delicious. I'm actually quite pleased the guy did this, because here we are talking about this kind of nonsense and what anonymity does. And look, we have it right here, and we had to shut down the chat because of this jerk.
And exactly. But let's think about that incentive structure too, right? Because obviously, like you and I are very fun to troll right now. Like people on Twitter are scanning around looking for people to target, to do exactly what this guy's doing. But if we create a different kind of playing field where trolling is less fun, so for example, if you are rewarded for getting engagement across social differences instead of on your own side, right? Trolling is going to be much less fun, because all these comments and snark, and negative stuff, right? It won't get boosted unless it's resonating across divides, and then trolls will sink to the bottom instead of rise to the top. That's my view.
That's right. That's right. That's what I think the platforms need to do. Stop focusing on content moderation. I want you to give me a switch or a lever on two things. One is sort of nasty aggression, trollish behavior, and the other is cognitive complexity. If you sometimes say on the one hand this, on the other that, if you sometimes say that, I want to hear from you. But if you've never said that in all of your thousands of tweets, I want to make you disappear. You can't see me, I can't see you. And that would disincentivize a lot of this behavior. And it would actually, if you want followers, if you want to be connected, you got to actually stop being so nasty and sometimes have some nuance here and there.
Right, exactly.
So with that,
I think so, but I would add one little nuance to that, John, and that is that, not everybody is going to do this, right? Like thoughtful, reflective people are, but this is a feature, not a bug, right? We're splintering social media all over the place, right? We have Pinterest for hobbies, we have Instagram for pictures, right? Why not a forum for politics? We know that most people could care less about politics. Something like 6% of posts on Facebook are about politics. Now, there's obvious downsides to this, civic disengagement, et cetera. But we also know that most opinion trickles down from kind of opinion leaders. There's a small segment of the population that cares.
Influencers,
right? Influencers, opinion leaders, right? That want to share this stuff. And, let's create a place for them to have productive debate and get rewarded for, and we even have models for this in technology, like think Stack Overflow, which is a site that, computer programmers use to help each other solve problems, and they get rewarded with status when they solve a problem, right? I mean, imagine tying status to solving public problems. This is the kind of thing that,
So Chris, have you ever talked with, because there are a number of investors and people in Silicon Valley who would like to do this. Have you ever thought of, or do you have well, maybe I shouldn't have you divulge your ideas here, but it seems like if you would team up with, some of these people and some of these venture capitalists, you could create a rival that uses a different plan, maybe not ad supported. Is there anything like that in the works from you or anyone else?
Not with us. Like what we are trying to do is build the scientific infrastructure so that other people can experiment. So like our goal is to make this platform that we've built something that everyone can use. And not just scientists like us, but also entrepreneurs. Like this question of, who's gonna, nobody likes social media. This is the funny thing, right? I mean, like nobody says, oh, I had such a good time on Twitter last night, or nobody says, wow, Facebook just gives me warm and fuzzy feelings. Okay, well, there's cats. Like there's some exceptions, right?
But sometimes it does. Yeah.
Sometimes it does. Yeah. But for the most overall, part, right, public dissatisfaction is rife. Like nobody, there's an appetite for something new. And especially once, as we're looking down to regulation. And if we take the long view, every 2 or 3 years, something new comes along, right? A year ago is TikTok. Now it's Clubhouse. What's going to be next?
That's right.
This is where like nobody's taken this scientific evidence-based approach to figure that out, and that's the huge gap that I think we need to fill.
That's right. Okay, great. So we were supposed to go from 7 to 8. We obviously got started about 15 to 20 minutes late.
Right.
The chat was interrupted. It looked like there wouldn't be questions, but Sabir has redirected things. He asked people to email, to email questions. And I do see 1 or 2 that made it through. So I encourage, let's have Sabir, if you've got one ready to go, why don't you come on in and either read it to us or something. In the meantime, I'll look at these. There's 2 or 3 questions here. Go ahead, Sabir.
Thanks. And to begin with, my apologies for needing to close down the chat. Thank you to our audience for being flexible and just sending in the email questions. So our first question, which I think we may need to dig into a bit, is from Arlene, who says, can you please address the social media prism and identity and power on a micro and macro scale? So I think she's asking you to sort of like clarify the difference between it as an individual user and then how we talk about it generally.
Yeah, so I think, the problem is we have the wrong model. We want social media to be a competition of ideas, but it's really become a competition of our identities. And in retrospect, that was probably predictable, right? I mean, we could argue about whether we've ever really had many rational debates in the media. But the key thing is that, when we go online, and I want everybody to think, think about the last time that you encountered someone whose views you didn't share on social media, right? Did you calmly kind of say, oh, that person has a point, when they were, say, calling Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez a communist or Donald Trump a rapist, right? This isn't the nature of social media debate. It's not, reasons competing for better evidence, right? We're experiencing attacks upon our side, and we're learning increasingly sophisticated defenses to defend our side. And this is what social media is doing to us. And so at the micro level, we're learning those tactics, and those are horribly detrimental. We have stories in the book, and this is why when we take people outside their echo chambers, which is what we do in the first few chapters of the book, we don't find that people focus on the moderates like a David Brooks or a David French or these kind of centrist people, right? No, they focus on Ted Cruz and whatever crazy thing Ted Cruz said the other day, right? And even for unenthusiastic partisans, we see they can become polarized in just a month of exposure. So we need to think about there's no simple fix. There's no dig deep in. Now we're getting to the macro. We don't just get into Facebook source code and flip a switch. That would be great. But we need to, it's a two-part process, right? These are emergent phenomena. There's the micro interacting with the macro. And so the macro is creating this incentive structure that's misaligned, but we're also participating in it. We're not, even though we all know that we're not changing each other's minds, which, by the way, when you ask people in surveys, do you think you're changing anybody's mind? Nobody thinks we're changing minds. So what are we doing, right? We're fulfilling,
showing off, we're displaying, we're
virtue signaling, exactly.
Yeah. So I think this, I really want to underline this point. This is, I think, one of the most important points in the book, and it's a point that it applies to so much of our politics. The gradual change from ideas or interests or material interests to identity. This is a theme of the 21st century. Absolutely. So Ezra Klein has this great book, Why We're Polarized. He reviews a lot of research from political scientists and sociologists, and that's the way he really summarizes it. Political parties used to be coalitions of interest groups and industries, and when that's the case, you can compromise. We'll trade off this for that. But beginning with that big, the sorting of the parties, and after the Civil Rights Act was passed in the 70s and 80s, which you referred to before, once we get these purified parties, the people in the other party really are different. They dress different, they eat differently, and that wasn't so true, before the 1970s, let's say. So that our national politics has shifted to be not even about material interests or money. It's been much more about identity. And I would say Trump made that much more so. And I think Biden is doing a good job of at least trying to go back to a more democratic focus on the economy and the working class, as opposed to the culture war stuff. And this is something that we're seeing on campus, and now it's blowing up in high schools and private high schools. The emphasis on identity, trying to encourage people to think about identity, and some are bad, some are good. And this is just blowing up cooperation, trust, education. So I would urge our audience, if you see this happening in institutions, just now it's like the shift to identity is really bad for a diverse liberal democracy. Okay, so I don't know if we answered Arlene's question. I think you addressed it better than I did, but let's have another. Sabir, do you have another question?
Sure, yeah. So our next question is from Barhadwaj, who says, we don't often think of Google as a social media platform, but a lot of our digital consumption does happen on Google. And recently, for instance, we have seen promotions on Google Maps for Black-owned businesses, etc. Knowing about going to such stores does give one the feeling of supporting small local businesses and marginalized communities, but does identifying them via Google risk unintended consequences? Is this something that can bring people more together, or does the ability to identify specific ethnic groups risk causing more separation or enabling harm?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating question. I mean, I think Google is understudied, which is criminal, because obviously it's the bit, we all use it. In fact, YouTube use is about 85% of Americans now. Facebook use is somewhere around 67%. So YouTube, in a way, is the dominant social media platform. It's not quite a social media platform. We'll comment on it, right? But the interesting thing about this point, I think, is this is a data question, and a privacy question. But it's also fundamentally about how do we discover each other? And, of course, an enormous strength and benefit of technology is exposing ourselves to more diverse information. And in its best incarnation, technology can help us do that. It makes us much more efficient. I know everybody complains about, algorithms that rank the content in our feeds, but can you imagine just hopefully not trolling through, scanning through every single, the cat's out of the bag, big troll. But that we're scanning through all of this information, right? Technology, when well designed, and that's a huge caveat, can help us do that. So I think that's the first point. But the second point is geographically, right? We are fracturing in powerful new ways. Already before Trump, before COVID, we knew that geographical polarization or segregation was happening. Recent study out of Harvard 2 weeks ago by political scientist Ryan Enos suggests that using high resolution voter data, the kind of data that mimics in some ways Google's resolution, very fine resolution, most Democrats and Republicans live in areas of the country where they will almost never interact with a member of the other party. That's a stunning statistic, and unfortunately, it means that for better or worse, places like Google are one of the few places. We're not going bowling anymore together. We're going to have these conversations online. So fixing this, for me, is one of the most urgent questions we could be working on.
Okay, let's take, if there's one more question, we'll take it. Otherwise, I think we should wrap up.
Our last one is a good one to end on. It's from Julie, who says hi from Omaha. And she says, looking forward long term, what do you think is the best case slash worst case scenario?
Mm.
Will polarization trend out since we all find it exhausting? Will
Yeah.
the elephant want to correct itself?
You know, I think all of us, and I know, John, you've written about this too, we all hoped that COVID was going to be this watershed moment, right?
Yeah.
In a way, it's the perfect common enemy, right? It's apolitical, or at least initially it was, right? It was a threat to all of us. It required coordinated behavior for all of us to address it. And, you know, I was finishing this book when COVID hit. And so I had this big moment, like, is it, you know, is my whole book, you know, going to be irrelevant now? We're all going to come back together. And one of the interesting things I was able to do is go back and revisit the characters from the book. And I do this in the conclusion of the book. And, you know, it was shocking to discover that this social media prism was as powerful as ever, right? The extremists were talking about conspiracy theories about, you know, China and bleach and all this stuff. The moderates were completely invisible, right? Even though, you know, strong majorities in both parties were agreeing about things like social distancing, closing the border, and so on in the first few months, we see the politicization of everything happen in large part because of social media, I think. And so certainly the current trends, I think, suggest, you know, if we can't conquer COVID together, and if social media is making that problem worse, you know, I'm a little pessimistic about the current course. On the other hand, as I said earlier, I think we're early in the story of social media. You know, we're really only 10, 20 years into this, and we can learn a lot, especially if we bring evidence to bear, and especially if we create, you know, opportunities for entrepreneurs to articulate what's going to be the next thing. How are we going to make it better? Also, these companies are competing against each other, you know, and there's some evidence, at least, you know, what they're saying publicly is that, you know, they also realize that it's in their long-term interest to create places that people actually want to be in, and that in the short term, you know, they're losing advertising revenue with these boycotts, for example. So, you know, like, my opinion, I want to hear what John thinks too. You know, my opinion is that we are at a critical moment, and we're at a fork in the road, and either it's really going to go off the rails even more, if that's possible, or we're going to see, you know, the blossoming of a new kind of technology.
So I'll have to say that if we channel Steve Pinker or Matt Ridley, and they're, you know, in the long run, things get better. And as you pointed out, with every previous major technology, there are disruptions. So if I had to bet, I would bet that 50 years from now, things are going to be a lot better, and we'll have figured this out. However, for the next 10 or 20 years, and probably for the rest of our lifetimes, my lifetime, not the younger people here, I think what has happened to us is that the Tower of Babel was destroyed between 2009 and 2012. In that story, in the Bible, God says, let us go down and confound their language, that they may not understand one another. And while it's always difficult to find the truth, I think that after 2012, we're in Babel, and social media has made it possible for people to create alternate narratives within every company, within every university, and everything is a battle to put your narrative forth. And so I think that we will never again find shared truth. I shouldn't say never again. In the next 20 years, we will not be able to find shared truth. And so I'm also despairing that good research such as yours, our ability to even agree on the facts, even within the social sciences, is being compromised by this. So I guess I would say to Julie, long-term optimism, you've got to be an optimist long-term if you look at history. But short-term, I'm very, very pessimistic. So I guess maybe I should have said first. Short-term, I'm very, very pessimistic. But long-term, you know, everything's going to be great. Okay. All right. So Chris, your book is wonderful. It's incredibly timely.
John.
It's very important. I urge everybody to buy it and read it. And I think, Sabir, you have the last word.
So thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Chris, for one, a fantastic event, and two, rolling with the punches tonight. Truly
We had a few punches all the way through.
Yeah, and to our audience, thank you for also rolling with the punches, joining us on Zoom. We really appreciate it. If you missed any portion of the beginning of the event, that's going to be available on our Facebook page, which is just at Strand Bookstore, so you can watch any portion you missed. I have dropped a link in the chat to purchase Chris's book if you haven't already purchased it. With that, any final words before we close out, Chris?
Just a huge thank you to the Strand. Please buy the book at the Strand. We need to support independent bookstores as much as ever. And because this might be on C-SPAN, I have to say hi, Mom. And thanks, everybody. Thanks to the audience. Thanks to John. This has been a pleasure, a real treat. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.